Robin Gibb carried two lives inside him for most of his 62 years, the one his fans celebrated on stage and the one he kept locked behind a silence that held for decades. He was the voice that floated above everything in the Bee Gees, the twin whose tone felt almost too fragile to belong to a human being. And yet behind that sound lived the man packed with contradictions, a husband who fathered a child with the family housekeeper, a boy who grew up performing between car races at a Queensland speedway, and a brother whose falling out with Barry never fully healed before death stepped in. The secret Robin kept wasn't a single thing. It was layers, each one peeling back to reveal something messier than the one before it. And it wasn't until the very end that anyone outside his inner circle finally understood what they had been looking at all along. December of 1949 brought Robin into the world alongside his twin brother Maurice on the Isle of Man, 3 years after Barry had already arrived and started filling the house with music. Their mother Barbara dressed the boys in matching outfits for performances, while their father Hugh taught them to harmonize using Mills Brothers records as a model. The older sister Leslie had a collection of vinyl that the boys treated like a personal library. Elvis Presley, Tommy Steele, the Everly Brothers, pulling records out and absorbing them one by one. Cardboard boxes stood in for guitars. Bedrooms became rehearsal spaces. The pretending was so serious it stopped being pretending fairly quickly. By 1956, that energy had moved beyond the house entirely. A movie theater called the GMA held Saturday matinees where kids could lip-sync popular songs. And the Gibb brothers arrived with Leslie's records and two neighborhood friends named Paul Frost and Kenny Ricks, calling themselves the Rattlesnakes, which sounded tougher than three small boys from Manchester had any right to sound. The sound technician dropped and shattered Leslie's record before their set even began. And what rescued them from an empty stage was Barry's real guitar, the only actual instrument any of them had brought, which he strummed while Robin and Maurice sang around him. The crowd of kids responded immediately, and that night performing stopped being a childhood game and started being something they chased deliberately. The Rattlesnakes came apart by May 1958, when Paul Frost and Kenny Ricks drifted away from the group, but the Gibb brothers reformed almost immediately under a new name, Wee Johnny Hayes and the Blue Cats, with Barry adopting the stage name Johnny Hayes. Then August of that year brought a shift of a different scale altogether. The entire Gibb family packed their belongings and left England behind for Australia, settling in Redcliffe, a coastal town located just northeast of Brisbane in Queensland. The hope was a fresh start. The music predictably followed them without any interruption. Redcliffe Speedway in 1959 became their first real performance venue in the new country. Between races with engines idling and the crowd restless, the brothers performed for audiences who hadn't necessarily sought them out, which turned out to be one of the better ways to earn attention. A racing driver named Bill Good watched them closely enough that afterward he contacted DJ Bill Gates, who agreed the brothers had something real, and started recording their songs and playing them on Brisbane radio. Gates assembled the name Bee Gees from initials pulled across the three of them, Barry Gibb, Bill Good, and himself. And that became Brothers Gibb, and then the Bee Gees, the name that would eventually appear on some of the best-selling albums in the history of recorded music. Their father Hugh became their manager, putting his photography business into second place behind their careers. Australian television shows like Anything Goes and Brisbane Tonight gave them early exposure, followed by nightclubs and theaters and bar stages that a lot of adults in the music industry would have declined entirely. The next door opened through Nat Kipner, an American songwriter and producer who had recently taken a position as artist and repertoire manager at Spin Records in Australia. Kipner recognized something in the brothers that the larger labels had passed over, moved them from Festival Records to Spin, and connected them with engineer Aussie Byrne and a modest recording space called St. Clair Studios in Hurstville, Sydney. The studio wasn't built for grand productions, but it gave the brothers room to work through material without pressure and experiment with their vocal arrangements freely, which turned out to be exactly what they needed at that stage. Chart positions followed, not massive ones, but enough to build momentum in the right direction. February of 1967 was when the trajectory changed permanently. Robert Stigwood, whose career had been built on identifying talent before anyone else in the room noticed it, heard the Bee Gees audition and signed them to a 5-year deal. Polydor Records would carry their music in the United Kingdom, Atco Records in the United States, and the international stage was suddenly within reach. With Colin Peterson and Vince Maloney joining the group, the sound expanded further, and people in the press started reaching for the most flattering comparison available, calling the Bee Gees the next Beatles, which was exciting and suffocating in equal measure. Their single New York mining disaster, 1941, arrived at radio stations in plain sleeves with no artist name attached, only the song title, and the resulting speculation that it might be unreleased Beatles material sent listener curiosity into overdrive, breaking the track into the top 20 on both sides of the Atlantic, giving the Bee Gees their first real foothold in the international market. But pressure distributes unevenly inside any group, and Robin was absorbing more than he could contain. A 7-week American tour in 1968 unraveled before it started when Robin collapsed and landed in a hospital bed with what doctors called nervous exhaustion, a phrase that covered a significant amount of suffering without naming it precisely. Barry and Maurice continued performing without him, and the absence registered in the sound in ways that were difficult to disguise. Creative tensions sharpened during Robin's time away and didn't soften when he returned. The argument that finally broke the group open centered on the single 1st of May, where Robin wanted Lamplight to lead as the A-side and got overruled by his brothers, and that was enough. He walked away from the Bee Gees in 1969, built his own career with the solo single Saved by the Bell performing well enough that the question of a reunion became genuinely complicated for a while. Barry and Maurice pushed forward with the album Cucumber Castle, but the absence was structural rather than cosmetic, and both of them felt it in how the music sat without Robin's voice holding the top. Maurice eventually reached out during a period when both brothers happened to be vacationing separately in Spain, and the apology he offered was simple enough that Robin could accept it. Back together as a trio, their 9th studio album Trafalgar arrived in 1971, led by How Can You Mend a Broken Heart, returning them to the UK top 10, after years of internal disruption and public uncertainty about whether the group would ever fully reunite. The second half of the 1970s rewrote who the Bee Gees were to the public. Disco had become the defining sound in popular music, and rather than circling it cautiously, the brothers moved directly into its center. Barry's falsetto, unexpected and stratospheric and completely unlike anything he had sounded like a decade earlier, became one of the most recognized voices in the genre. You Should Be Dancing announced the shift, and then the Saturday Night Fever soundtrack locked their name into a specific cultural moment that still defines how most casual listeners understand their legacy. For several years running, they occupied every corner of popular music simultaneously. Disco's collapse arrived fast and without mercy, and by the end of 1979, the genre had become a target. Radio stations cut the catalog, and the hostility felt personal rather than just commercial. The Bee Gees were so deeply tied to disco that separating themselves from it meant separating themselves from most of what had made them famous, and that was not a trade anyone wanted to make. A lawsuit arrived claiming they had stolen portions of How Deep Is Your Love, and the court initially sided with the accusation before overturning the ruling completely a few months later. The brothers were cleared, but the emotional drain of fighting it never reversed itself. Grief, oddly, pulled them back into the public's warmth. At a concert honoring Andy Gibb, their younger brother who had died in 1988, Barry, Robin, and Maurice wove Andy's recorded voice into a live performance of Our Love Don't Throw It All Away, in a way that left the audience genuinely shaken, and that night reminded the brothers of what they still carried together. The one-night-only worldwide tour that followed became a full career revival, not a nostalgia act but a reintroduction that reconnected them with a global audience in a way the disco backlash had made seem impossible just years earlier. Maurice died in 2003 following sudden health complications, and with him went the Bee Gees as a functional trio. Barry and Robin retired the name out of respect, absorbed the loss differently from each other, and stayed away from any shared stage for 3 years before appearing together at a Miami charity event in 2006. Robin's cancer entered public knowledge when he told the BBC in early 2012 that surgeons had removed a tumor from his colon, that the cancer sat barely detectable now, and that what remained were routine cleanup procedures. His fans accepted that framing completely. Then April arrived, and Robin was in a coma, and May brought his death, and the confusion about what had actually happened lingered long afterward. His son Robin, John Gibb, stepped forward with a correction that news outlets had been getting wrong. Kidney failure killed his father, not colon cancer. The cancer had reached remission. What destroyed Robin's kidneys was the accumulated toll that chemotherapy and extended illness had placed on his body, combined with sedatives administered to manage treatment side effects that his liver couldn't metabolize properly. A seizure arrived 3 days before his death. His condition deteriorated faster than the medical team could reverse, and he died from kidney and liver failure while still in a coma. Robin John spoke openly about his frustration with the doctor's conflicting approaches in those final weeks, and the gap between his father's cheerful February interview and his April hospitalization was never fully bridged by any explanation that satisfied the family. The other life Robin had been protecting cracked open in 2009 when a daughter named Snow Robin Gibb was born to Claire Yang, the family's housekeeper who was nearly half Robin's age. His wife of nearly 30 years, Dwina, found out. Dwina was a Druid priestess and practicing artist he had met in 1980 through her cousin while she was working at a beanbag factory in London, and her reaction to the news went well beyond anger. Robin's first marriage, the 12-year union with Molly Hollis, who had worked as a secretary for the Bee Gees' former manager, had produced a daughter named Melissa and a son named Spencer, and Robin had spent years largely absent from their lives before reconnecting with them when they were 12 and 10 respectively. His estate sat valued at over $140 million at the time of his death, though the money was never really the frame through which Robin's life made sense. What made sense was the voice, the brotherhood, and the decades of harmony between three boys who had started with borrowed records and cardboard instruments and built something that outlasted most of the industry they worked inside. Barry's eulogy at Robin's funeral carried regret about the distance that had grown between them during the illness, and in 2013, Barry's first solo tour became a sustained tribute to everything shared and broken and never fully repaired. Every song a way of saying what their unfinished conversation might have sounded like if there had been more time. Capitol Records signed a deal in 2016 to steward the Bee Gees' catalog into the future, making sure the harmonies the Gibb brothers spent their entire lives building would reach listeners who hadn't been born yet. When a record without a name on it first came through the radio and changed everything,